The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. I am your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I am so excited to once again welcome back to the show, Amy McElroy. Amy, welcome back.
Thank you, Rebecca. As always, pleasure to be here chatting to you.
Well, you are becoming like a regular on this show now, aren't you?
I know, it's brilliant. I love it.
I love it too because I think you're so fun to chat with, and I am learning every single time I chat with you that you are just a wealth of knowledge.
Oh, thank you. I love chatting to you too.
Well, today we are going to talk about somebody that I haven't really covered very much on this show, and that is Mary Tudor, sister of Henry VIII, Queen of France. So, this is a great topic because I think there's something so intriguing about her, and to me, maybe a little mysterious just because I don't know very much about her. And yet, she played such a huge role at Tudor court, in my opinion. So, what got you interested in Mary?
Um, when I was researching Educating the Tudors, which was my first book, I was intrigued about her relationship with Henry to start with. Obviously they grew up together, they did have a good relationship. He essentially spoilt her rotten, but then I suppose you could look at it that she was a princess. It was her due, so to speak. And it just kind of expanded from there. So I wanted to look at what happened to her when she left England, that kind of thing, and just her life in general and her relationship with Henry and how that changed over time. But I think she's very overshadowed. Obviously, he was king, so you can understand that he is written into history more. But I think there's a lot more to her than first meets the eye when you hear Mary Tudor. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is you always think of her niece.
Hmm.
So Mary the First, which is, I understand that as well, because again, she was queen. But I think Mary definitely needs some limelight of her own. So yes, here we
Yeah.
are.
Yeah, I was going to say, and that's exactly what we're here to do today is put that spotlight on Mary. And I think, like always, we probably should start at the beginning. I think most people know, obviously, that she was the daughter of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. But let's look at her childhood a little bit more. Can you give us a little bit of insight into what her childhood may have looked like?
Yeah, of course. So Mary was born in March 1496 at Sheen Palace. She would have then gone into a nursery, so with wet nurses, ladies looking after her every whim. And the royal nursery at that time was largely at Eltham. Um, they did move around when needed to allow the palace to be cleansed, but that was the main residence for the royal nursery. At that nursery, when she would have gone into that, would have been Henry and Margaret. So there was a child born before Mary named Elizabeth who sadly died. So there was just Henry, Margaret, and obviously Arthur. But Mary would have seen very little really of Arthur because he was off learning how to govern and to be the next king. But she would have spent a lot of her early childhood growing up with her brother and sister. Um, we know that they had visitors to the palace who would go and visit the royal children. For instance, Thomas More and Erasmus went to visit them. And they would have had lots of company in the forms of servants who would look after them, play with them, and of course, their education. So Henry, we've spoken about this in one of the previous ones, had an exceptional education, and it is thought that Mary probably shared some of his lessons when she got a bit older, not as a baby. We also think that Elizabeth of York taught them to write because of the way their handwriting looks in comparison to hers. But yeah, she would have had lots of toys. she would have been dressed in what was standard for a Tudor princess at that time until she reached the age of 45, which then she would have flourished into what I would call adult clothing. So proper gowns and things like that that we often picture on any Tudor queens or the high nobility, that kind of thing. Then she would have been wearing them and playing with her dolls. And yes, when she wasn't busy, probably running around after Henry. So.
I think when I think of Mary, I can't, I have to go back because you're, I was just flashing back to a previous episode when I was talking about Mary coloring. You were talking about her education versus Henry, and Mary is off in the corner coloring outside the lines. Okay, now I got that out of my system. You have to go listen to that episode. All right, anyway. Okay, so Mary, she really experienced a lot of death and sadness in her early years. And I think it's so easy to forget that. I mean, a lot of people during this era did because the mortality rate was so high. But when it comes to family members, she really experienced a lot at a young age, didn't she?
Oh, she definitely did. So obviously the first one that would have impacted her would have been Edmund. At the time, she was only 4. Edmund was a baby. So children and death, we don't know how much that impacted her, but she basically lost her baby brother who was at Eltham with them once he was born. Then in 1502, we have the death of Arthur. I think that one probably would have impacted her as well, although she would have known not much about him. She obviously did meet him, but they wouldn't have spent time together like Henry and Margaret. So I do think it would have affected her. And obviously, she would have seen the grief of her siblings and her parents at that time. And then you've got the next year, she loses her mum, Elizabeth of York, is pregnant again. She gives birth to another little girl called Catherine at the Tower of London. But sadly, Elizabeth of York dies.
Mm.
And then within a few days, Catherine dies as well. So, she's facing quite a lot of death in the family by the time she's only 7 years old. So for a youngster, definitely we can't deny that it would have impacted her, especially losing her mum at such a young age. And whilst you can argue that she was in a royal nursery largely with her siblings, I think anybody can, understand that it would have been upsetting for a child to lose her mom.
Yeah.
And then it was only 6 years later that she lost her dad.
Mm.
So yes, quite a lot of death. And then within months of that, her grandmother, Margaret Beaufort. So yes, definitely a lot of loss for
Yeah.
such a youngster to experience.
Oh, for sure. And then we have to take into consideration too her sister Margaret leaving court within that time. So this sibling that had always been there is suddenly gone now too.
Definitely. So Margaret obviously got married to James of Scotland and left. So she made her way up to Scotland. And I think that would have been quite a big blow for Mary. She's lost her oldest sister, who she would have spent a lot of time with. Um, I think part of it would have been comforted by the fact that when Arthur died, Catherine of Aragon returned to London. So I think she did gain some comfort from having Catherine around, although they weren't always in the same household. they did spend time together. So I think she did gain a sisterly affection for Catherine. But obviously nothing changes the fact that you've lost
Yeah.
your sister, and at that point she didn't know if she'd ever see her sister again. So nobody knew like if Margaret would either come back to court at some point or whether Mary would visit her. They wouldn't have known that. So yeah, quite big blows for a youngster.
Can't even imagine what it would be like for your sister one day just to leave and go to another country and then not know if you're ever going to see her again. That's so foreign to me.
Yeah, I think they would have had an understanding in that they're princesses, so the expectation was that they would go off and marry. Highly unlikely that they would be married to somebody within England because they needed it made sense for them and the country for them to marry outside and form those relationships, those alliances. But for such a youngster, she probably didn't quite fully understand the impact of what that meant, whether thinking about Margaret or herself and what that looked like for her future. It's quite,
Yeah, it is sad. So she loses her mom in 1503. She's still a kid at this point. Who becomes her biggest female influence after her mother's death?
I believe it was, she had a lady in waiting, so to speak, that was Lady Jane Guildford. For her, she called her Mother Guildford, which I think says it all. So I think she was very influenced by her. I think their relationship was very close. But I would also say her grandmother before she died.
Mm.
So Mary was given a companion called Jane Poppincourt, who was there to obviously provide company, but as well to help her learn French. So it acted as a dual purpose, so to speak. That sounds wrong when we're talking about people, but I think the idea was that she not only had some female company, but it would also help with her education. And Margaret Beaufort was very educated. Um, and I think that she wanted her grandchildren to have an even better education than herself. So I think she had a big influence on Mary's childhood and the provision of a companion for her. But I think in terms of closeness and that motherly relationship, it was probably Lady Guildford.
Hmm. Was she married to Henry Guilford?
She was, and she only had one son as well. Sadly for her, but yes, that is
Hmm.
Lady Jane Guildford.
We've talked about her on the show with Dr. Emma. We call him Fun Guy because he was the guy who knew how to throw a party at Tudor Court. So that gives me a
That
little
might
bit.
be her son.
Okay.
Her son was quite close with Henry, so
Yeah.
yes,
So maybe that's who it was. It could have been her son. Well, then it's possible then Mary knew him as well.
yes. She definitely made a contribution towards his wedding. There's records of that, so I think she did have a very good relationship with that family.
So I think by guilt of association, Mary probably knew how to have a good time.
I would say yes. I think when you've got a brother like Henry when he was young, I don't think you're gonna get away with not having a good time, really, are you?
I can't even imagine what it would have been like at court when Henry became king at such a young age. Like how exciting it must have been. What a change of atmosphere.
Yes. I think Henry, although he did have a good head on his shoulders, I think he took advantage of the fact that I'm young, I've got all this money that my dad has worked so many years for to, fill the coffers. I'm gonna spend some of it. So I think, yeah, it would have been a very enjoyable time for the youngsters at the Tudor court. I imagine the older ones were probably shaking their heads a bit, but yeah.
Oh, well, it was time to let their hair loose.
Yeah.
I would like to talk a little bit about, we talked about her being a Tudor princess and what that meant as her role in the family. So, who was the very first person that Mary was betrothed to, and how old was she?
So the the first request for a betrothal was made by Ludovico Sforza, who was the Duke of Milan. At that time, Mary was only 2 to 3 years old, and he approached Henry VII on behalf of his son, Massimiliano, who at that time was the Count of Pavia. Um, Henry did brush him off, kind of thing. He wasn't rude in any way. He just said she's too young. Whereas we can probably sit here and go, he's not going to marry a princess to a count. It's just not going to happen. So he essentially said, no, she's too young at the moment. We'll see in the future. Now, Henry VII was very, very clever. He knew that he needed to make alliances. He was the first Tudor king, and he needed to, secure his throne, not just for himself, but his family. And when Mary was around 8, I believe, no, 10, 11, there was a treaty of perpetual peace signed between Henry VII, Maximilian, who was the Holy Roman Emperor at that point, and Prince Charles of Austria, who was Maximilian's grandson. So that treaty actually, as well as the peace, forged the alliance by the betrothal of Mary and Charles. So that was the aim. In December 1508, there was actually the proxy betrothal between those two. So at that point, they wouldn't have seen each other. They may have seen portraits, but they wouldn't have been in the same country. It was all done by proxy. So that was Mary's first betrothal, which for Henry VII is a huge success. So by that point, he would have had Arthur, who had married Catherine of Aragon. So he's forged an alliance there. Obviously, we know that Arthur died and whatever happened after that. He'd forged an alliance with Scotland through the marriage of James and Margaret. And now he had the opportunity of his daughter possibly becoming the wife of the future Holy Roman Emperor. So I don't think you can get much bigger. So for Henry VII, massive success. But yes, that was her first betrothal. So she was still only very, very young. She probably didn't understand like everything that involved, but yes,
Yeah.
Charles.
Now that you put it that way, it was a very smart move on Henry VII's part because already at this time, his eldest surviving daughter, Margaret, is aligned with Scotland. Scotland seems to have always had some kind of connection with France. So
Yeah,
there's some safety and security there. And now he is really solidifying his alignment with the emperor with this betrothal. Like, people do not give Henry the Seventh enough credit, do they?
they definitely do not. I think the things that he did whilst he was king are very undermined by obviously the larger than life Henry VIII, which in a way you can understand, but when you look at what Henry actually achieved, exceptional. So I definitely agree. They don't
Yeah,
give it enough credit.
definitely not. This might be a random question. Did Henry VII have any type of nickname for Mary like Henry VIII did for his daughter Mary?
Not that I've come across yet. We never know. But I haven't seen anything yet.
I just think about how beautiful people say she was. Let's talk about that. I don't want to talk about that too much because it's not about how beautiful she is. I want to talk about the person. But she was seen as a very attractive girl and woman for the time, wasn't she?
Oh, definitely. So I know that you can say that ambassadors are biased and they will write what they think people want to hear and everything else, but there's so many records that refer to her as either beautiful or they will say she's not tall, but she's not too small. She's slim. They talk about her eyebrows even. So I think definitely they did have this understanding that for a lady at that time to be beautiful, they had to be fair skin, blue eyes. And I think Mary was basically that. So, yes, there are a lot of comments about how she looked and how beautiful she was.
Okay, I have to go back. Eyebrows? You have to say more about this eyebrow. What did they say about
I
her?
think they were just very kind of like I believe that the ambassadors would try and report something that somebody else possibly hadn't. So I think it was just comments like between all the different courts about her, what she looked like, why, for instance, Charles may not be unhappy with the match, or why everybody else in the royal court would like her because she would fit in, because she's beautiful. And I think one of them refers to a lady in waiting at the court of Austria saying, oh, she definitely doesn't look like her, for instance,
Oh.
which poor woman, you know what I mean? But I think, yes, they just tried to make the most of what they could after they'd seen her and give a good description because it's not like today where you could just take a photo and send it to somebody. They had to just write it all down and or wait for a portrait anyway. So,
Yeah. And sadly, during that time, when you're a royal princess, really it's your pedigree and your appearance that mattered, wasn't it?
yep, yeah. And
Oh,
whether you could sing and play musical instruments, apparently.
yeah. Yeah. Was Mary rather musical like Henry was?
Yes, so she would play the lute. There are records of her receiving a lute and having the strings changed and things like that. So, yeah, I think her and Henry probably had a very good time through music and singing and dancing and yeah.
I like to think of Mary and Henry like me and my younger brother, like just two siblings who are close and like to have a good time and maybe goof around a little bit. I'd like to imagine that's what her life was like.
I'd probably say, yeah, I think they did have that close sibling relationship. And I think Henry being the older was probably quite protective of her, but still in that fun way. So he did include her in court events if they were doing masks or dances. She was always included. So I think, and he would partner with her in dancing. So yeah, I'd say they definitely had a fun relationship.
Oh my gosh, there's like I have so many questions now, but I don't want to linger too long on this part of her life because she had way more life to talk about. So let's move forward a little bit because okay, so she was betrothed to Charles, who is going to be the future Holy Roman Emperor. Um, at what point did that fall apart, and at what point did she then become betrothed to the French king?
Okay, so when Henry VIII died and Henry VIII was proclaimed king, he actually continued the negotiations between the Holy Roman Emperor regarding the marriage of Mary and Charles. So in 1513, there was a new treaty signed, and that one was between Henry and Margaret of Austria, who was Charles's aunt. But she was regent of the Netherlands and she was acting on behalf of her father, Maximilian. That treaty basically gave instructions that because this had been going on for so long by this point, that Mary and Charles would actually marry before the 15th of May, 1514.
Oh,
Yes. So it was when Charles effectively came of age. So, or within a year to basically say this needs doing. Like we've got to get this over and done with. It's been years in the making. And I think Henry was kind of putting his foot down at that point that, we're not going to continue these negotiations. Now, Maximilian never quite says, no, this will not go ahead, but he's always kind of pushing boundaries. And I think he saw it as England needed him more than he needed us. So he would continually be putting things off or asking Henry for men for his wars and things like that. And then Charles's other grandfather, Ferdinand, at first, when Henry VII was still alive, was using it as a bargaining chip, i.e., I will agree to this once Catherine marries Henry. So he kind of used that. Now, obviously, when Henry VIII married Catherine, he didn't have that bargaining chip anymore.
yeah.
So he'd try other methods and just put things off. And I think Henry VIII just got fed up of it. They went behind his back and signed a treaty with Louis. Obviously, at that point, France and England were still not on the best of terms. And I think he just saw it as, they're completely undermining him. He might be young, but he is a king and they're just playing games. So now Mary did renounce the betrothal herself on the 30th of July, 1514. So not long after the date that was given for they must be married by this point. And I think that was Henry essentially saying enough is enough. Now, we know Mary did it herself and she spoke the words in public with witnesses to renounce that betrothal. But we also know that there's no way she would have done that without any influence from Henry. So, if she's ordered to marry somebody by the king, she will. So, yes, that was Henry putting his foot down. And then within a week, 10 days, there was a new peace treaty signed between England and France. So you can pretty much infer from that Henry had actually been going behind their backs as well, out of frustration and negotiating with Louis. So within a week of that was the first of the proxy marriages between Mary and Louis. And at that one, the Duke de Longueville acted as a proxy for Louis. So that was the first part of that. They did do the whole ceremony, and then the Duke de Longueville actually touched his bare leg to Mary's bare leg as a way to consummate the marriage, so to speak. And then a month later, Louis did the same in France. So obviously Mary wasn't there, so the Earl of Worcester actually acted as proxy for her. Yes. So, which always makes me laugh because I think, poor Louis, Mary gets her to speak her vows to a duke, and then poor Louis.
He gets a dude. This is fascinating. As you were talking, it made me realize some things too, how political these matches really are, because unless my memory is just, working against me right now, 1513 was the Battle of Flodden, right? When Margaret Tudor became a widow after James IV was killed. So that alliance that they had through Scotland, which also kind of protected them from France, was weakened. And so this was like a political move for Henry to keep an alliance with France. And he already had a connection with Ferdinand through Catherine of Aragon. So
Yeah.
yeah, smart.
I think Henry was smart. We can by all means judge him for his later actions, but I think he had a good head on his shoulders and he did make smart choices. And I think he surprised people, especially Ferdinand and Maximilian, who never thought that he'd do something like that. They just expected this young king to let them push him around, essentially, and he
Yeah.
obviously proved them wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. He definitely, I think he had some good advisors behind him, like
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Wolsey probably helped out a little
Yeah.
bit there.
Yes.
Okay, so she is now married by proxy to Louis XII of France.
Yeah.
And in what is it? Is it October that she goes to France finally?
Yeah, so she leaves court in September, and obviously, being the Tudors, they make a huge deal of it. So there's like a procession, and everybody comes out to say goodbye to her. But they reach Dover early October. Um, and unfortunately, at that point, there's storms out at sea. So they are delayed a little bit. But Henry actually goes with her and Catherine. And on the day that she's leaving, Catherine does stay in the castle, but Henry goes to the waterfront and essentially waves his little sister off. He was due to sail out and go part the way and then come back, but he decided against that. I think it was probably the right decision for him because once they set sail, there was more storms and her fleet of ships was actually separated. But obviously, thankfully, Mary did make it safely, or we wouldn't be here now probably talking. But yes, it was in October that she reached Boulogne and then made her way towards Abbeville to meet Louis.
Yeah. Do we have any idea what she thought of Louis?
No, but well, I think being a Tudor princess, she never outright insults him or anything. But we do know that obviously she thought he was old, which for them he was. He's in
Yeah.
his 50s. So I don't think she said anything nasty. Um, but I think you get a sense of her because there's a record that says um she was due to arrive at Abbeville. Louis decided to go out on a surprise hunt. Shockingly bumped into her.
Oh, fancy meeting you here.
I know. And apparently, they describe like what she was wearing and things like that, and what he was wearing. And Louis was obviously very, very happy. And she blows him a kiss. And apparently it completely like confused Louis. He didn't know what that was. But yeah. But I think that just gives you a sense of Mary that, she knows she's got to do her duty, so she may as well make the use of it. And you can just imagine this Tudor princess decked in all these beautiful gowns, jewels sparkling, and she had a cap apparently just cocked on the top of her head and blowing this 50-odd-year-old a kiss. It must have been the best day ever for Louis.
Ah, he was like, look at that young thing. She's all mine.
Yeah.
Yeah, that match, like age-wise, to us now is just astonishing, but it didn't really matter then. Her purpose was to create heirs, right?
Yes, and act as kind of an intermediary between Louis and her brother. Um, yeah, I think she knew her role and just decided that I may as well run with it. And
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in your book, you mentioned her as an ambassador. Was she officially one, kind of like Catherine of Aragon, or unofficially?
no, she was never official, but I think being Queen of France and obviously being the sister of the King of England, that expectation that you would do what you can to keep peace is always going to be there. So yeah, she was never official, so she was never given any documents or anything like that way to confirm her as an ambassador, but I think it was just the expectation that she would do what she can to act for both parties.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Louis did not live very long. I know I'm fast forwarding through time a little bit, but we have limited time to talk today, so I want to make sure we cover everything. But Louis did not live very long after they were married. And I want to know, and I'm sure people listening want to know too, did Mary really have some type of an agreement with her brother that she could marry whomever she wanted after Louis died?
Um, so the story goes that when Henry saw her off at Dover, I didn't mention this because I thought you might ask, um, she made him promise that I'm doing this one for you, essentially. So I'm marrying your choice for you, for England, but you need to promise me that if he dies before I do, which is a given, um, I can choose my next husband for happiness. And Henry agrees. Now, whilst we don't have those exact words written down anywhere, sadly, we do have Mary making reference to a promise.
Oh.
So, yes, it is safe to say that he did promise her that she could make her own choice if she survived living. Quite nice.
Well, yes, and little did Henry know who her choice was going to be.
Yeah. I imagine he probably just thought she'll go to France, she'll get pregnant, and that'll be it.
Yeah.
So even if Louis does die, at that point she'd have a completely different role as mother to the heir of the boy. So I think he was probably banking on that, to be honest.
Okay, so let's talk about then what happened. So Louis dies. Mary has to go into mourning for, what is it, 40 days.
Yes.
What
So
happens?
so essentially she for France at the time, mourning clothing was white, hence where she got the moniker of La Reine Blanche or the White Queen. And she was, I say sent, that sounds quite harsh. She was basically retiring to the Hotel de Cluny, which was, it's not a prison, it's a beautiful palace at the time, um, to spend her time in mourning. So she would have had her ladies with her, but yes, it would have been not what she was expected. She would have had quite restricted. There wouldn't have been all the dancing and stuff that she was used to. She was obviously in mourning. And the second part of it was to see if she was pregnant.
Mm.
So that obviously she's a queen. If she is pregnant and that child is a boy, then she's going to be mother to the next king.
Yeah.
They needed to know if she was pregnant, especially Francis, who at that point was expecting to be king. He was married to Louis's daughter, Claude. So they would have been waiting to see, A, is she pregnant? And then obviously when they realise that she's not, she's back on the marriage market. Poor Mary. So at that point, we understand that it's not just Mary that has to think about her future. There's Francis, because he's king of France now. And, Mary being a widow, she's entitled to a lot of money and properties. He wants that money to stay in France. So the best thing for him is if Mary marries someone in France and stays there, because then the funds stay in the country.
Yeah.
For Henry, he knows that that would be the best thing for Francis. But I think he also is aware that he can either try and make a new alliance with this, or he can keep his promise to his sister. So I think there's varying aspects that Mary would have been well aware of what was going through their minds. She wasn't stupid by any means. So I imagine those 40 days for her were quite intense on her thinking about her future.
Yeah. Did Charles Brandon have any idea what he was getting into?
Um, my own opinion is I think he suspected something would happen. So apparently, Charles was sent abroad to bring Mary home, essentially, and give congratulations to Francis, and obviously give their sympathies for the death of Louis. Now, Henry apparently made him promise that nothing would happen between him and Mary. So it then makes you question, why would he do that if there was nothing there?
Yeah.
So whether he knows his sister that well that he thinks she is not going to want to stay in France, she's going to do everything she can to get back to England, or there was some kind of affection between them.
Hmm.
Yeah, but I think he at least suspected that something might happen.
It's so interesting. And something did happen. Obviously, they got is it fair to say secretly married in France?
Yeah, so it's referred to as a secret wedding, but Francis was there. And I don't obviously none of us have been to the 16th century courts, royal courts, but I just don't understand personally how it can be a secret if the king is there. Like, everyone at that court usually knows, or at least his closest people knows where the king is at all times. So if he was there, it's not really a very good secret, is it? So, um, but yes, technically it was a secret, and yeah, Francis was there, and yeah, then word spread and got back to Henry.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So I don't want to dwell on this part too much because I feel like we talk about this so much when it comes to Tudor history enthusiasts. We read about it. I think I'm hoping everybody who's listening today knows that, Charles Brandon and Mary go back to England and they're essentially punished, quote
Mm.
unquote, by Henry VIII, and they have to pay these large fines. Cardinal Wolsey kind of helps to coordinate the whole deal, right?
Yes, he does. So he kind of acts as an intermediary between Charles and Henry. So you see Mary taking quite a lot of the blame. So Mary essentially says, "It was me. I did it," because that's her brother.
Yeah.
Whereas Charles writes quite a lot to Wolsey, like, "Oh my God, blah blah." But I think Henry had an inkling what had happened, and it was all just for show that I can't not punish them because I have to show a reaction. Like the nobility would have torn him down if he hadn't reacted in any way. So I think he had to, but as you've just said, the large fines that were very rarely paid and things like that. I think it says it all, doesn't it? That Henry did the best acting of his life at that point, I think.
Yes, I think that's the part that seems to be often overlooked in stories about the time is that Henry had an idea of what was going on, and he did have to play the political parts because he was king. He had to keep his favor. So Charles and Mary come back, and Henry's like, "Well, now that you're here, you might as well have a real wedding, right?"
Yeah, yeah. So they had another wedding back in England. Obviously, Henry was there. Um, Yes, and he greeted them when they came back and was very nice to them. So, and they spent a lot of time at the royal court. So I don't think he was as angry as people like to think. He probably was a little bit grumpy in the fact that, oh, if she hadn't have done that, then there's a possibility that I could have married her somewhere and made either another alliance or at least a lot of money. But what's done is done. It's his sister and his best friend. So what are you gonna do?
Yeah. Yeah, it did kind of ruin things for him a little bit because now he didn't really have those political pawns to
Yeah.
help him out. He did not yet have a surviving daughter at this point, right? Because Mary wasn't born until what, 15, 16? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So all of his all of his pieces were already occupied or yet to be born. So Charles and Mary are now officially married on English soil. How did her life change once she was back in England and now the Duchess of Suffolk and Queen Dowager of France?
Well, Charles did have a property in London, Suffolk Place. And I think when they first returned, they spent a lot of time either there or at the court. Like for Henry, my sister's back. Like she's my dancing partner. She's the jewel of the court. So I think for him, in a way, he wanted her around and obviously his best friend. So I think life kind of would have been a little bit similar to how it was before she left, that she was enjoying all these court entertainments. But obviously by this point, she wasn't living, well, 100% under the responsibility of Henry. She was now married. Um, so I think all in all, it changed in terms of what her role was. So she was still the sister of the king, but she was now a duchess, although she did refer to herself as Queen of France for the rest of her life. Um, but then she actually got pregnant in 1515 and gave birth to her first son, Henry Brandon, at Bath Place, which was the property of Wolsey at the time.
Okay.
So obviously not far from the royal court. So I think it's safe to say that she would have almost gone back to normal until she became a mother. Um, Sadly, the first son didn't survive adulthood, but um, they would have stayed around London. Obviously, Brandon at that point had quite a lot of properties. And although they had been fined and were meant to be paying all of this money, he did put a lot of money into redeveloping Westhorpe, which would eventually become their base home. So, but at first, it wasn't ready for them to live at. They did visit and stuff, but it wasn't ready for them. So they largely stayed around the London area if they weren't visiting one of his other properties.
Hmm. Interesting. So she had a really good relationship with Catherine of Aragon, didn't she? I want to talk about that because I think that's an interesting relationship for us to look at.
Yeah, so I think, as we talked about earlier, I think Catherine would have filled part of the void for Margaret going to Scotland. But when Mary was back, we know that Catherine would visit her. So if she was on her way to Our Lady of Walsingham, for instance, she would then go and stay with Mary on the way. And they would spend time together. So I think they definitely had that sisterly relationship. Um, there's also, I think Mary, it's safe to say, took Catherine's side through the whole Anne Boleyn episode.
Yeah.
Um, quite bravely, I think.
Yeah.
So yes, I think they definitely had a close relationship, and I think she really respected Catherine and cared for her. So I don't think it was just a case of you're the queen, so I've got to respect you. I think she genuinely had sisterly affection for her.
Hmm. Do you think Catherine named her daughter after Mary?
Possibly. Obviously, Catherine was very pious, so it could have been after Virgin Mary. We don't know, but I think there's a chance that she was named after Mary. So you can see it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Just as Elizabeth of York named her last daughter Catherine, likely after Catherine of Aragon as well. Just
Yeah.
I like that. I like it shows some closeness in these relationships,
Yeah.
and we love to talk about the relationships between women in this time because they're so overlooked.
Yes, they definitely are. And I think when you look through the records and stuff, when you see like Catherine stopping off at Mary's house and she's there for a few days, I just think that's quite nice because you can probably just see them sitting in front of a fire, like reading together or embroidering, and Henry's not allowed. Well, he would have been allowed, but you know what I mean? It was a let's have some girl time. So I think that's quite nice.
Yeah, I like to imagine that too. Do we have any idea of what kind of mother and stepmother Mary was?
Um, Mary, when she married Charles, Charles had two daughters from a previous marriage. Um, she actually requested that they come and live with her. So, and she didn't have to. Do you know what I mean? Like the girls at that point, one of them was at the court of Austria with Margaret. Charles had managed to get her a place there. So, I think she made that decision that I want my stepdaughters here. And they genuinely mourned her when she died. So I think it says what their relationship was, that they really respected her and had that closeness with her. And the same with her own daughters. I think, you know, they had a loving relationship with her, and she actually did really well in, negotiating marriages for all of Brandon's children. I'm not just going to say hers because obviously she did have to think about her stepdaughters as well. So I think she was very involved and she used the influence that she did have to help not just her own children, but her stepdaughters as well. So yeah, I think they had a close relationship.
Yeah, it fascinates me because Charles Brandon comes off as such a sleazy womanizer sometimes, doesn't he? Like, how did she end up with somebody like him? It blows my mind.
I know. I think he must have been really fun, and you can kind of see it because obviously he's Henry's friend, and people usually have friendships with people that are similar. So we know that they spent a lot of time jousting together and playing sports together. So, and that's what Mary grew up around. So I think she probably just, you know, we know that he didn't have the best history with women before Mary, but I don't know. I like to think that they genuinely cared for each other, like as Mary was growing up, and I think he did love her. At
I,
least I like to think so.
I just realized there are similarities between Mary Tudor and myself because I too dated my brother's best friend. So I didn't marry him and it didn't work out between us. But we didn't have any children or any of that, but I could see the appeal, right? There is some comfortableness that comes with also being around somebody that you know is trusted by your brother.
Yes. Yeah.
There's a safety and a security that comes with, well, he can't be so bad, can he? He's my brother's best friend.
Yeah, they'd done court entertainments together before. So we know that they featured in the same dances and the same masks and things like that. So I think the three of them, Henry, Charles, and Mary, all had fun. So I think you can kind of see why
Yeah.
she was drawn to him. And then, yeah, I do think he loved her, but I'll stop being soppy.
Well, they had, how many children did they have together in all?
So Mary, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, her first child was Henry, who sadly did not survive adulthood. Um, Together, they had Francis, Eleanor, and then a second boy, also called Henry.
Yes.
Um, but the second Henry was made Earl of Lincoln, so she did get to see him receive a title, which I think would have been amazing for Mary. You know, she's seen her son honored, and yeah, so they had four altogether, but only three survived.
Right.
But
And then the Earl of Lincoln, her son Henry, ends up dying too, doesn't he?
yes, very sadly, he also dies. So the ones that went into adulthood were Francis and Eleanor.
Yes. Again, so much loss in her life. And of course, her duty, so to speak, as a wife at that time was to provide heirs for her husband, male heirs specifically. And and this almost seems like she's in a very similar role to Catherine of Aragon in this respect. And now she's lost the other male heir. Is there anything in the records that talks about um, disappointments from Charles that his son had died or worrying that he doesn't have an heir, or did it not matter as much to them?
Um, I think I think it did matter to him because, you know, he was a duke. He'd been married to the Dowager Queen of France. So realistically, he did need an heir because otherwise his estate would be torn apart. So he couldn't leave it to one child if it was a girl. Like it would just be split up. But he never seems to have turned on Mary. And it could be that he thought, whatever happens, I'm still young enough.
Yeah.
So, and you know, he proves that because he does go on to have more kids. Um, but yes, he never seems to turn on Mary. And obviously, at the time of her death, she was, this sounds really bad, she was old in terms of childbearing for a Tudor woman, but she wasn't old. So before she died, they probably thought there was still options for her to have more children anyway. So
Yeah. How old was she when she died?
she was in her 30s when she died, which is really sad because it just, well, for me personally, it makes me wonder what would have happened for the rest of her life. Um, how would she have gotten on with the rest of Henry's wives, and how would her niece, how would her life have been different? So I think obviously for Mary the First, when she lost her mom, she was very much isolated. So it just makes you wonder, would Mary have stepped in and took our niece under her wing? That kind of thing. Would things have been completely different? But I guess we'll never know.
Yeah. I mean, in the end, when you look at, if we go back to her losing the male heirs, she was still a princess of England. She was still the sister of the king. So I'm sure Charles Brandon looked at that too, like, oh, there's some safety and security here. I'm brother-in-law to the King of England. But I do wonder, Charles Brandon died in, I think, 1545. Had she lived, what would her life have looked like? Would she have remarried? Would she have gone to a nunnery? What do you think would have happened?
Um, oh, that's a good question. I would say that she wouldn't have remarried. I think, obviously, being Brandon's widow, she would have gained a dowry from that. So she would have had income from that. She already had an income from France. So I think she just would have lived her life. I do like to think that she would have been part of her niece's lives, both of them. But yeah, I think she would have just stayed at Westhorpe, out of the way, or maybe attended big events, but largely out of the way, and just lived her life. And, you know, we know that she did like to have visitors. So she had her other niece, Margaret Douglas, would come and stay with her. So I think I can see that she probably would have, a bit like the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk when she had Catherine Howard and all of the young girls stay at her house, but not as naughty. So I think she probably would have had something similar to that, in where it was an environment for young ladies that they could, learn how to grow up, learn how to run a household, and who better to teach them than a princess, a dowager queen and
Yeah.
duchess. So
Oh, I love that. When you mentioned Margaret Douglas spending time with her aunt, it really warmed my heart and made me immediately feel, I don't even know how to describe it. I feel differently now about Mary since you said that. And that seems like such a random thing to turn me, but I feel like I see her as an even more caring and kind and loving person, that she is welcoming her stepdaughters into her home.
yeah.
She's welcoming her niece of her elder sister into her home. I think she would have been a force to be reckoned with had she lived longer.
Oh, definitely. And we know that Henry may have got mad with her on occasion, but they were never completely like out of touch. So they may have had arguments, but all siblings do.
Yeah.
So I definitely think she was powerful in her own way, in the influence that she had and what she could get away with.
Yeah.
There's not many that, could get away with speaking out publicly against Anne Boleyn and, marrying somebody without asking the king and things like that. So, yeah. But I think they just had that close relationship. It just, the way I see her is she was a genuine person and she cared about people. So we know that she was always trying to help others, like whether that was her old French tutor that she was trying to get a job elsewhere, or a man that was, when she was in France, that there was a guy that was held in prison in England, and she was asking Henry to release him because he'd fought alongside their dad, kind of thing. And she's like, I think she's just one of those. You can partly say it's expected. She's a princess and a queen, but yeah, I think there was something more. I think she was very people orientated person.
Hmm. I don't know why, but I was just like curious, like, do we know what sign she was? Do we know what
Uh,
month she was born or anything like that?
March.
Yeah, so I don't
Is
know
that
enough.
Aquarius?
Oh goodness. There are people listening who are like, "Oh, I know this answer." I don't know. My daughter was born in April, early April, and she's an Aries. So I don't know if she would be an Aries or whatever's before that. Anyway, I'm gonna have to look into this after after we're done today, because I do feel like sometimes I'm a Libra, so I like to bring people together and keep things fair and balanced. That's just part of my nature. And when you were just describing her, I was like, I'm curious what star sign she is. You
I don't know.
you
I
just
don't
never know where my head
know.
is. Have you learned yet? You just never know where my mind is going to go, Amy. It just randomly shoots off
But
in
both of
different.
us, when we finish this, we'll be going off to Google what star sign it was.
Exactly. I have to know now. Oh gosh. Okay. Well, let's wrap up by talking about Mary's legacy. What is the legacy that she leaves behind for history?
Um, oh, okay. So obviously, I think the main thing that she is known for, sadly, in a way that this is the main thing that she's known for, but also sadly, what actually happened is that her granddaughter was Lady Jane Grey.
Mm.
And, you know, would that have happened if Mary was still here? Who knows? But I think we have to credit Mary somewhere with not just Jane, Catherine and Mary Grey as well, how they actually turned out. Because I think she was a large influence on her daughters. So, you know, I think Lady Jane Grey, especially out of the three, is very well known to have been exceptionally educated. And I'm not saying Mary taught her, I'm not going to say that at all. But I think the influence is there. So I think she influenced her daughters, who then in turn had that influence on their own children. But for Mary herself, I think she should be more remembered for who she actually was and what she actually achieved. Like, I know it's like a big, seen as a big fairy tale and all of that, but I think she was really clever in what she actually did when she was in France. So not only did the people of France accept her and celebrate her as their queen, but she was very smart. Like, and she, she sat by Louis's bed when he was sick. She wasn't off dancing and partying and whatever else. So I think she was very, very caring. And I think all of that is overshadowed by Henry, essentially, or her niece, Mary. So I think she definitely deserves some limelight. The other thing that does bother me, though, is her grave. I think it's very underwhelming for somebody that was a princess, a queen, a duchess. It is quite sad when you see it. But then I suppose, she was moved at the Reformation. So I think, it is what it is, but I do find it quite sad that it's just a little white curb, and yeah, that's pretty much it.
It's interesting the similarities in that respect to her and Catherine of Aragon with these understated tombs.
Yeah. But then Henry as well.
Yes. Yes. Wow. Okay, Amy, so I'm going to put you on the spot here. If you were to describe Mary Tudor, Queen of France, Duchess of Suffolk, in one word, what word would you choose?
Compassionate.
Oh, that's a good choice. I
I'd
like
say
it.
compassionate. Yeah.
I love that. Amy, thank you so much for coming on the show today and talking about this fascinating woman that we know, but we really don't know very much about, right?
Oh, you're welcome. It's been fun yet again.
Yes, we'll have to do this again. We'll have to come up with another topic to
Yeah.
chat about because I feel like I've learned a lot from you in these last 3 episodes that we've done together, and it's been a great joy to have you on the show. So thank you so much.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.